Got it. Sorry, I just had to hit record because I forgot to do that earlier. And so let's address what Ryan's talking about in terms of that of the escalation clauses, because I will tell you that whereas for me, we went into this market and I was like, escalate, 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 because there was a reality that in the beginning of this market, we were one of the only real groups of people who were actually approaching the market with an escalation clause. For those of you who have been utilizing them for the last number of years, you can likely attest to the fact that you used to be kind of alone when you were using them, and then as the market got hotter and hotter, and as the momentum picked up, all of a sudden everybody looked around and said, "What can we do?" And there were more discussions being had across the board about escalation clauses, and they became almost more normal than not. And what I think we've seen happen in the last 6 to 12 months is listing agents and sellers looking at the escalation clause as something that they as Ryan just mentioned, they're not necessarily interested in dealing with, right? And so the first question is, do they have that right? Does a seller have a right to say, look, I don't want to see an escalation clause. I want to see an actual number.
Yes, they do.
Yeah, they absolutely do, right? If that's their choice, that's their choice. Does the listing agent have a right to make a unilateral decision about that without consulting the seller?
No.
In a perfect world, no. And yet, how ultimately would we know? So really, my point here is, if what comes back to you nowadays is we're not accepting escalation clauses, do yourself and your buyers a favor. Stop fighting that. Just nod your head and say, okay, so I'm assuming that means that you're not accepting them from anybody, right? If you're not accepting them from anybody, we'll go back and we'll revise the offer to actually have a number in it to present to you. But I don't want to find out later that we went and revised, but somebody else refused to do that, and ultimately the seller then had a change of heart and said, now you're getting our big number and you're escalating off of that number because you saved one on the side. Right, I want some clarity around that from the listing agent. And so a conversation around the escalation clause, I think, is really your best strategy forward today. If your clients are looking to utilize the escalation clause, I would give a call to the listing agent to say, look, I'm writing up an offer for 123 Main Street. It will include an escalation clause, and it'll include a powerful escalation clause. Talk to me about how your seller is going to handle offers, knowing that ours may come in with an escalation clause. I'd want to hear that from the listing agent so that I could then go back and have a conversation with the buyer to say, here's what I found out. They're either not going to look for that, or they're really excited about escalation clauses. I'd ask a question to the listing agent about how will the seller handle multiple escalation clauses, right? Because can that happen? Can there be 12 offers and 6 of them have an escalation clause? Yeah, absolutely. I think we talked about it a couple of weeks ago, right? Where literally the math on trying to figure out who's escalating off of who and where the top numbers are, you kind of need a PhD in lots of different areas of mathematics and physics and perhaps modern dance, just to kind of make it all make sense. Frank, you had a question.
Sorry. Just to be certain, the escalation clause is basically that if somebody offers better, our client will top that or top it by a certain amount, right? Is that?
Yeah, an escalation
correct?
clause basically is exactly that. That our offer is $5,000 over the highest verifiable offer that you can produce, right? So if everybody else tops out at 500, well, then our offer becomes 505, and presumably, if money is the determining factor, presumably we would then win in that scenario. Tama just put in the chat, a few months ago, escalation clauses seem to be working and getting things accepted, and now less so, right? Listing agents are asking for the most attractive offer. It is what we're seeing. So just note that it's not a dead strategy, and yet you may need to ask some additional questions around how the sellers will look at that, and if the sellers will look at that, before you waste time on the buyer side going through this whole conversation around what the escalation clause is and how it works and why it's a powerful tool, right? I would save yourself that conversation with the buyer until you know that the house the buyer is looking to buy will actually entertain it, or else you kind of look like a dope, right? You go through this whole big conversation around this great powerful tool only to then write it up, submit it, and have it come back to the buyer. No, we're not doing that. Well, that was a whole lot of wasted words then, right? Anything else on the escalation clause that you've been experiencing or want to discuss? Nada? All right, so I think the takeaway for escalation clauses is they still work. I wouldn't shy away from them. The one thing I will say about escalation clauses is if you're going to use one and you're having that upfront conversation with the seller, with the listing agent, that the seller is going to entertain it, make it worthwhile. And I guess my point is, I'm not sure $2,500 over the highest verifiable offer or $5,000 over the highest verifiable offer is in the market that we're experiencing today. I'm not really sure that's worth it, right? To a seller. I think if you make something way more attractive, notice the words that Tama used. Listing agents are asking for the most attractive offer. Well, guess what? You know, $10 and $15 and $20,000 that's probably more attractive unless you're in an extremely low price point. Then your $2,500 is, your $1,000 is, your $5,000 is. So if you're going to use the escalation clause, like really use it in order to win. Does that make sense to everybody? Okay, good. What else? What else have you been using and or have questions around? Anybody waiving contingencies? And if so, what kinds of contingencies are you waiving? I'd love to have a conversation around that because I know there's always questions around whether that's a good thing or a bad thing and how to kind of navigate through that. All right, let's start at the top. How about mortgage contingency? Anybody having buyers waive their mortgage contingency?
Only with all cash offers.
Okay, so only with all cash offers. And so talk to me a little bit about that, because and I think I see Karen Karen on the call. So Karen, when you're done with whatever you're doing, maybe you're eating a sandwich or something, turn your camera back on because we want to ask you a question. Because I'm always curious about buyers' reluctance, and sometimes it's buyers' agents' reluctance to waive mortgage contingencies. So talk to me about what you're experiencing. Are you having those discussions with your buyers and they're afraid to do it, or are they or you're not having the discussions because you yourself think it's dangerous? Tell me what you're experiencing so we can kind of discuss it. Go ahead, Silva.
The answer is depends, because we have so many unknowns. We cannot put everything under one umbrella, you know. I mean, if you feel and if you see that you can waive contingencies, then go for it. But you have to talk to the buyer, discuss all the ramifications, talk to their mortgage broker, ask 100 million questions to see if it is really doable and to what extent. And also it depends on the condition of the house, of course. You can go ahead and waive the building inspection. And I do it actually all the time. But you have to be kind of sure that it is not going to backfire.
Yeah, so let's stay focused, because we're going to move to the building inspection in just a second. Let's stay focused on financing for just a minute. So I agree that everybody's different, right? And yet I do think that there are opportunities for buyers to have conversations with their lenders where they kind of ascertain what the risk actually is, right? And so I'm talking about the no risk, no reward conversation here. If you have buyers who are so freaked out that they may not get their mortgage, I think there are different questions to ask before we get to, is this a good strategy for you to win the house? If you have buyers who are freaked out that they might not get their mortgage, I think the conversation I might have is this a good time for you to be buying this house? Is this a good time for you to be buying at this price point? Maybe there's a different price point that would create better comfort in your financial world, such that we could then not have to deal with all the stress and worry about, I might not get my mortgage. Yeah, Yenny.
I've heard from a mortgage broker like a year ago. I suggest to waive the mortgage contingency, and the broker said that they can lose their license if they find, if they get this procedure done. So I don't know.
Yeah, that kind of sounds like I don't know. Karen, are you here able to pop back on? Again, we do have Karen on. I just don't see her face.
I
All right,
did it once with another broker and we closed, but then I suggested another client through the mortgage broker, and he wouldn't do that because he might be at risk of losing his license.
All right, so there's Karen. So what Yenny's saying, Karen, is that a mortgage broker told her once that if the buyer client waives the mortgage contingency and something goes sideways, that they're at risk. It sounds like a bunch of crap to me, but I'm curious about what your thoughts are.
They waive their mortgage contingency?
And then if the borrowers waive their contingency and in order to get the house get the win, and then something goes sideways where maybe they kind of wish they didn't, that somehow that puts the mortgage broker at risk of something.
If you said that they can waive their mortgage contingency and you put something in writing to that effect, then yes, it comes back to haunt you, just like anything else. But as long as you can get, if they waive their contingency and then decide to get a mortgage, it's fine. But if you sign your name to something, I guess legally they could come back to you, but nobody's ever done that to me in 25 years.
Okay.
Yeah, it sounds to me like this conversation we're having, both for buyers and perhaps for the loan officers and the mortgage brokers of the world. It's a conversation around, again, risk versus reward, right? There are things that we each do every day. Is there a risk to you to get in a car and drive wherever to the supermarket? Well, sure, but you also have to eat. So you decide to take the risk that comes along with you getting in your car and driving to the supermarket to get food, because the reward is far better than the risk. And so I think it's always about weighing those two things.
I know that somebody doesn't qualify, I'm going to let you know, no, they don't qualify, and then you're not going to spend the time if they need to get financing looking at that house.
Yeah, and so I think that that's the difference there. As far as I'm concerned, Yenny, is that if the broker says, hey, this person is crazy qualified, and yet there's always things that could happen, right? Because the buyer just forgot to disclose the fact that there's some kind of a lien on their property, or the buyer forgot to let them know that X was happening in terms of their job situation. Well, the broker can't be held responsible for those kinds of unknowns.
Right. If nothing changes and all of a sudden you said they qualified, they waived their contingency and they really don't qualify, there's probably some risk there somewhere.
Yeah.
But if they qualified when you spoke with them and then down the road they quit their job or they retired, things that are out of your control, then it has nothing to do with the broker.
Yeah.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Good to know. Okay.
Rick,
So Chris first and then Silva, that's the order of the hands that went up.
This might be a question for Karen, but I know there's a pre-qualification part, which really doesn't mean a whole lot because you're not in it. But if you get a pre-approval and you actually have a conversation with your buyer saying, okay, don't buy any furniture, don't buy a car, and don't quit your job, we can get to the point where we're at a pre-approval stage where you're pretty much approved, just waiting for an offer to come in or to write an offer. Is that the case? Can that be it? Can that be an option?
Not sure if I understand totally, but if I write a pre-approval letter for one of your clients, you can bet for sure that I have looked at their income, savings, credit, and debt, because I'm just not handing them out like candy, like, oh, here, you want a pre-approval letter? Because your time and effort and offer depends on my telling you, yes, they're qualified.
Can I continue to answer that question? Because I think what I heard Chris ask, Karen, is there one step further than just a pre-approval that might be a strategy to use with buyers? And my answer to that, and Karen and I have used this together, is that kind of pre-underwritten
Right.
place. I don't know what to call it, but it's where you move your buyers through not just a pre-approval process, but they go ahead and deliver as much information to Karen as possible. Karen kind of puts it through underwriting to pre-underwrite them. And now all you're really waiting for is a property address and an appraisal, because everything else has been looked at. Can you talk a little bit more about that, Karen?
Yes, we can do a couple of things. We can put it through the automated underwriting system, which is a step better than me just looking at it. It's actually having Fannie and Freddie say, yes, this meets our guides, and you can go ahead and submit and get an approval. And I do that we all at Westport Mortgage do that for everybody. No doubt about that. But then we can take the next step and actually submit it to the lender for the lender to, did you just lose me?
No.
For the lender to underwrite it and have them give you an approval, a commitment from the lender, and that brings you to that next step. And then all you need is an appraisal and title, of course, and a contract. But yes, and we try to bring everybody in as far through the process as we can. And the only thing that has stopped us from going to that next level sometimes is the volume that some of the lenders weren't pre-approving all the time, because they have so many refis and so many purchases that it would get bogged down there. But we take them through the process as far as we possibly can every time.
Aaron,
Ryan, just let me make sure that answered Chris's question, because I think that's where you were headed, Chris. I was kind of trying to read your mind a little bit. Is that where you were going?
That is where I'm going. So if you're working with a buyer, I think you just got to prepare them down the road that you need to get to this spot where we can write an offer and waive the contingency.
I also love what Karen said. And so one of the things that I just wrote down was, are we using the strategy? Are we just getting the pre-approval letter or that pre-underwritten approval from Karen? Or are we getting it and then making sure that the listing agent knows exactly what was done to get them to this point, right? Are we selling what Karen's doing? If they're actually going ahead and utilizing pre-underwriting software, are we letting the sellers and the listing agents know, look, this is not just somebody who looked at income and assets, right? This has actually gone through pre-underwriting software to get someone further along, or this has actually been pre-underwritten and we have a commitment from an underwriter. We just need these three things. If you're not selling that across the table, you're kind of losing the punch. So I think that's a really good point, to make sure that we know where those things, where the buyers stand in their process, and then make sure we sell it across the table. So Ryan, I know, did you have a question specifically about that?
Yes.
Yeah, go ahead and ask it, and then Silva, I'll come to you.
Just to clarify, Karen, you had mentioned you can get a commitment from the lender. Is that kind of going back to the offer form? Does that then dissolve the mortgage contingency date? Is that effectively satisfying the mortgage contingency due date on the offer?
Well, you have an appraisal that you have to take into consideration. So if you are skeptical about it appraising, or if you know or haven't had that conversation with the buyer saying, if it doesn't come in, do you have the money to cover that? Then that's a consideration.
So
in a take into account.
Okay, so in a situation, let's say, would this be a valid scenario where you could take someone through the automated underwriting, you could submit it to the lender, get their commitment to the loan prior to the appraisal. And so on the offer, could you say mortgage contingency date done, so long as the buyer was willing to pay in cash any amount over, say it appraises $20,000 less. If they're willing to come to the table with that at closing, would that satisfy, effectively get rid of that mortgage contingency and that due date altogether?
I say yes and no. I mean, yes, yes, you could say 20,000. What if it's not 20,000? Right now, and let me back up just saying that right now I'm not having or seeing any appraisal issues. A month ago, I had appraisal come in $100,000 less than the purchase price, and it killed the deal. And nobody was expecting that. So if you are pretty confident in the price point and you have the comps and you know that you're safe there, that's fine. But we've seen a lot of things this year that aren't normal.
Got it. Okay.
Here's how I would answer that, Ryan. I would answer that by saying that with something that is pre-underwritten like that and has one of those, TBD, those to be determined, what the address is, loans that are committed to by the lender ahead of time, I think the conversation then is not necessarily about whether that in and of itself is a yes or a no to whether it meets that date requirement. I think the conversation is around, does that give your buyers enough confidence to start waiving things, right? So I think that the conversation it's not a light switch. None of this is ever a yes or no. It's a risk reward conversation, and knowing that the lender has committed to X, Y, and Z may give your buyers the confidence to then say, okay, you know what, then I am okay waiving the mortgage contingency, right? Because I know I know one way or the other, I'm going to get that loan, right? When Karen and I buy my investment properties together, I never have a contingency to the mortgage, because what I know is that it's always going to be approved. Even if Karen has to kind of tweak things on the tail end, even if that means something came up in my world where all of a sudden the program that she pushed me in, I have to go to a slightly different one and the interest rate is maybe a little bit different, or whatever, or the appraisal doesn't come back and we have to kind of play with some cash. Like, so I'm never worried about obtaining the mortgage, because I know that that's all going to come through, and Karen will just figure out how to make it work. I don't mean to put all that on you, Karen, but that's how I think, right? I mean,
Right.
just being honest.
But you're also in a situation where you have the credit profile where I can do that comfortably. Not everybody has that. And if you do, then we can have that conversation. The other thing you can do is, have me call the listing agent and the seller and say, hey, my clients are really great. Pick me, pick them, and that goes a long way.
And what's awesome about that is that then Karen kind of lists, here's why they're so great, right? And so she can actually explain to the listing agent about that they're pre-underwritten, or that there is a commitment, or there's this, that, and the other thing. And so then so my main point, Ryan, was I think it's one more tool in your tool belt, or at least another conversation, but I think it still rests with the buyers. I don't think it's a good idea for you to go to buyers and say, hey, because you're pre-underwritten, therefore you should waive your mortgage contingency. I don't think those two things are always connected. They could be in certain scenarios. Instead, you may be able to go to buyers and say, hey, because you are this far along and this is what you've heard from the lender, a strategy could be for you to waive that contingency date. Here are the pros and here are the cons. Let's talk to the lender about that. Let's talk to Karen about that and get clarity around that, so you have the decision you're making, but it may give them the confidence to move forward. That was my only point.
Got it. Thank you.
The attorney will jump in and say, hey, no, you can't, we don't want you to do that. I mean, they're there to protect you.
Right. And my version of that is, thank you for that protection. However, there's nothing to protect if they can never actually get to the table and be seriously considered for a house, right? So I get that there are certain risks that we're talking about here, and yet when you lose house after house after house after house, at some point you have to wake up and either decide this is not the market for you as a buyer, or that you're willing to take a few more risks, because I guarantee you that's what's happening with the people who are winning the houses. They're paying more and they're taking more risks. Silva, thank you for your patience.
No, it's okay. It just happened 2 weeks ago. We waived the mortgage contingency because we were competing against cash offer, and the listing agent said, just waive the mortgage contingency if you'd like to win. So I discussed with my clients and their mortgage broker. That's fine. My clients are very credible. They have been through this scenario several times. They are not afraid to waive the building inspection contingency either. And then all of a sudden, the mortgage broker got scared because it was a condo. And then it's not only that the buyer has to be qualified, but then the condo has to be qualified. So there are more reasons to actually lose down the hill, and waiving mortgage contingency was not the smartest thing to do. So the long story short, we actually backed out of this because it seemed to be too steep to deal with.
Yeah, so just remember, there are always going to be mitigating circumstances, right? There's always going to be the what if, there's always going to be, and so the clients and you and the mortgage broker always have to weigh all the facts around a certain scenario before making those decisions. We are talking in generalities, and as Silva said 20 minutes ago, in some of these conversations, the generalities that it's hard to answer because there are so many other small details that might have to be taken into consideration, which is 100% true. So Silva talked about waiving building. Any other questions, comments on financing, strategies for financing, waiving versus not waiving? Can we just pivot real quick to appraisal, waiving appraisal contingencies, because they're kind of connected, right? We kind of touched on it. The good news is that for the most part, as based on what Karen just said and what I'm hearing and seeing from you guys and your colleagues, is that we seem to be kind of out of, for the most part, the real punishing couple of months of massively increasing housing prices without the solds to support it. And so we had struggles over the course of the spring with appraisals. For the most part, that's not happening quite as much anymore because we have so many solds to balance out we're also not seeing this in terms of prices, right? We're seeing more of this. They're still kind of rising, but they're not rising quite as steeply. So the whole appraisal thing is balancing itself out. I get asked 3 times a week whether or not it's a smart idea to waive the mortgage, the appraisal contingency. And my answer is always the same. Do the clients have the cash to cover the difference, right? And have you had a discussion with them about what the appraisal actually is? And what I mean by that is too many people believe that an outside third-party appraisal is the be-all end-all of value to a property. And that is just 100% not true. It's one person's outside opinion based on current conditions and based on what they may have had for dinner, that evening about that particular property in a snapshot of time, right? It has nothing to do with the buyer's perceived value. If the buyers perceive a higher value, that doesn't make the buyers wrong. And I think that we as agents have to do a better job of helping people understand exactly what the appraisal is done for. The appraisal is not done to verify the value that you're paying for the house. The appraisal is done to have the bank be certain that if you default, they can sell the property for enough to recoup their investment, right? That's why an appraisal is done. Say it again, Karen.
Actually, the appraisal is done to protect the lender's loan to value. So if you're buying 95%, you're getting 95% financing, they want to make sure that their 95% is protected, that there is an additional 5%. And remember, it is a moment in time, like you said, but it's a recap of what's happened in the past, not necessarily what's happening today and in the future. Although they do take market conditions into account. It's really using past sales. So we're fine today using past sales because they were so high. Where before we were having a problem because the past sales didn't catch up yet. So
I recently heard it described as, I love this this description. It's like when you're on a plane, right? And the plane is taking off, so it's barreling down the runway. And the appraisal is done just as the front tires lift off the runway. That's the snapshot. Well, then it takes a week to get the actual appraisal back. And so now the appraisal comes back, except the plane kept taking off and now the back tires are off and the snapshot is here by the time the appraisal actually shows up, right? So Karen's point about it's using the past to predict the future is 100% right. It's not the best solution to what the bank is trying to accomplish. However, until they perfect crystal balls, it is what they will use, right? Because it is kind of like flying a plane, looking out the rearview mirror, though, right? Ryan.
So in the event of an appraisal coming in low, and you've waived that contingency, what is the only option to come up with it in cash, or are there alternative options?
you can put less down so that you're getting your loan to value is higher if the purchase price, if the appraised value is lower. Because remember, you're getting a percentage of financing based on the purchase price or the appraised value, whichever is lower. So if you plan on putting 20% down, but now that doesn't cover it, you could put maybe 10% down. And if you qualify, you can still buy that house and still obtain financing. It's just a different product, a different program. Now you're qualifying for something else, not necessarily the product that you were approved for initially.
So changing the actual loan program is a strategy that I love as a conversation, right? Because oftentimes we, not Karen, but we are not having those conversations with the buyer, right? Karen may have that with the borrower, right? Who are the same people, just by the way, but we call them something slightly different. So I'm going to use that as a differentiation point between who's talking. But now that we've had this conversation out loud, just know that there is that opportunity to say, you know what, don't panic. Let's have a conversation with Karen. She may be able to move you from program A to program B and still make this work. And yes, Ryan, the other opportunity is just remember, you don't have to all of a sudden pay cash. You only have to be able to close the gap that the appraisal doesn't cover, right? So the idea is if you're buying a $500,000 house with 80% financing, the appraisal has to cover that $400,000 loan as it relates to the value of the house, right? Stop me, Karen, if I'm saying something.
Right. No, that's correct. So
right.
Now maybe you put 10% down.
Right. Or you just bring the extra amount in cash to the closing. You don't have to bring everything in cash. You just have to increase the amount of cash, because if the appraisal comes in at 480, right? Well, 80% of 480 is whatever that is. That's the differential that you're talking about. You're not talking about something massive usually, right? You're talking about a smaller amount that maybe it's inconvenient or not ideal for the buyer to bring to the table. But again, people have to make decisions about whether or not they're looking to win the day and live in that house. And so sometimes that comes with a level of inconvenience. I like to keep my cash in my pocket too, but there have been times where, the appraisal is just a little wonky. And then Karen and I have a conversation. Okay, do we fight it? Do we try and get it? My answer is, for the amount of money, I think the last one we struggled with, Karen, I had to bring $8,000 more to the table. Right. And so, what are we really talking about here?
And if you're in doubt at all that it might not appraise, get the comps. At least have that conversation with the buyer beforehand so that they're not shocked. Like, oh my God, I thought it was going to appraise. I was sure it was going to be higher, and it never has to be higher. We just want it at value or as close to it as possible.
And lastly, and I do see there's a question, and it's hard for me to see who that is. That Janine? I think it's Janine. Is it Janine? Yes. Okay, because your name is 123 Let's Write. So
Yes, it
all right.
is. I have to
Okay.
fix it. Sorry.
Yeah, no worries. I'm going to come to you in just half a second. But the point I wanted to make is this: have the conversation with your buyers up front that says, look, this is what's been going on with appraisals, and involve Karen in these conversations, right? Because frankly, she brings a higher level of credibility about saying this than you do, because that is really on her side of the transaction. So allow her to contribute to that conversation to say, look, we're not really seeing the appraisal issues pop up as much as we had been. And here are the solutions that we can work on if something happens wonky with the appraisal, if you feel confident in waiving that. But my point to you guys is sometimes I hear people saying things like, oh, I can't let you do that because it's too dangerous. Don't make that decision for your buyer, right? Explain the pros and cons, get someone like Karen into the conversation so that she can explain the pros and cons, and then let the buyer make their decision. Because it's not your decision, right? And it's not your job to wrap the client in bubble wrap. Your job is to give them all of the information and help them make a good decision for them. A good decision for them may be a very risky decision, but if they choose that that's the decision that works for them, as long as you've given them either resources to give them the pros and the cons or the pros and the cons, and they've still made a decision to go with something risky, well, that's a decision they've made, right, to live in that house. So just be careful about that. Be careful about that. If they don't win the house, it doesn't matter if the appraisal comes in high, low, or in between, right? Because they didn't win the house. So first things first, be the winner, and then troubleshoot things that pop up after the fact. I see too many agents talking to their clients saying things like, you know what, with what we have to bid for that house, it'll never appraise anyway, so let's just not even bother. I'm not sure why anyone would ever say that, right?
If you are going to bid at higher than the suggested price, as you call it, then be prepared to finance that much. Know that you have either some extra money or know that you can afford, if it's on for 480 and you're bidding 500, know that you can afford 500.
Yeah, indeed.
In loan or in, cash, whatever.
Indeed. That kind of preparation solves so many of these issues, right? If you have buyers who are literally spending their last penny on a house, well, it's no wonder that when something goes sideways, it's a drama and things fall apart. Again, I think some of the answer to that is between Karen's conversation and your conversation is helping people buy within their means, right? It doesn't mean they have to spend everything that they're approved for. They can back off of it a little bit so that there's room for some error and for some drama to crop up. Go ahead, Janine. Thanks for waiting.
Oh, no problem. It was just a comment on what you're saying. So there's a lot of banks out there that are going to be waiving appraisals because, and it depends on how solid, like what you just said, how solid the financing is. If the buyer is buying within their means and the offer is close to the value, I'm seeing the banks waiving appraisals. So it's not always a deal breaker. Is it risky? I mean, if the bank is willing to take the risk to waive the appraisal, they seem to think it's a good price and it's solid. So I don't know. I just wanted to make that comment. And yeah.
Yeah. So again, every scenario is going to be different. And if you have a lender that is looking at all the facts and saying we'll waive it, then simpler. Go ahead, Karen.
I have to run, but yes, when they do waive the appraisal, they have enough real estate data on that property to validate the value that we're providing to them. So don't be afraid of that at all. And no, you don't get an appraisal, and no, you cannot ask for an appraisal to be done on your behalf with that lender either. I've had some people say, can I get an appraisal done? You can with your own money, with your own appraiser, but the lender won't do it. I mean,
Yeah.
that's the last thing you want anyway.
Yeah,
Because-
don't invite trouble.
I
No,
agree.
never. No appraisal, no, good thing. I love it.
All right, let's pivot to inspections, right? Because I know that I know that some people are waiving inspections as well. And what is that looking like? And let me ask a further question. When you're waiving the inspection, are you waiving the inspection itself, or are you waiving the right to have a conversation about the results? Because one is a far better path forward than the other.
The second.
Yeah. Yeah. So if the conversations that you guys are having with your buyers about waiving inspections are waiving inspections, period, I don't recommend that. Waiving inspections, waiving the right to exit the contract based on the results of the inspection, that's a very different thing, right? So you're willing to, basically what you're saying is, I'm still doing my inspections and I'm willing to accept the house in an as-is condition, right? Contractually, you now don't have an opportunity to say, you know what, I wasn't expecting that big foundation crack and I'm scared about it, so I'm going to run in the opposite direction. But see, I kind of think that's okay. And I'll tell you why. I don't know that I've ever found a house where someone inspected it after actually having walked through it and put their own eyeballs on the house and discovered something where the solution was burn down the house. Right? Now, Chris, you lived in Georgia for a whole lot of years. And so in Georgia, sometimes that black mold issue that you all were dealing with down there.
That's what I was thinking of.
The answer was burn down the house. The good news is we haven't had that up here, right? And so again, I'm speaking in generalities, clearly. My point, however, though, is, again, I waive my mortgage, my inspections all the time and always do them. And even when I accept the house in as-is condition and then do the inspection, if there was something that I wasn't really planning on, that I couldn't really see, I still have a conversation with the seller around it. I'm okay if the seller comes back and says, no, you said as is, go pound sand. And yet I can tell you that I have never actually had that happen. I've had a conversation, the seller, I told you guys that story about the chimney 3 weeks ago, right? Where the seller just volunteered to do the $4,700 repair. I've had conversations around a credit. I've had conversations around splitting the repairs. I've never had a seller come back to me and say, you know what, you said this and now you're asking for that. We're out. So is it how you're having the conversation perhaps on the tail end? So what are you experiencing with waiving inspections, or you're not waiving inspections? I know, Sylvia, you said that you were doing the inspections anyway, but just waiving the right to use them as an exit from the contract. And that's been working well. Do you think that has been one of the reasons why some of your buyers have been winners versus over other people?
I haven't had a successful example to give, but I believe so. I believe that the answer is yes, but for other various reasons. But I've done that. So I unfortunately I cannot give you a specific example.
Anybody feel like that's way too risky? Anybody kind of nervous about that kind of a waiver?
Well, we've been hearing lately horrific stories, right? And buyers listen to these stories. So I do believe that it is pretty scary. It should serve specific particular purpose with minimal risk in order to go for it.
So what are some strategies you can use?
Yeah, I think,
Go ahead, whoever is, Janine, go
yeah,
ahead.
yeah, thank you. Yeah, thank you. I think it depends on the age and condition of the house. I think it also depends on if your buyer is has enough cash on hand to cover some potential defect that might come up on the inspection if you're waiving it, I mean, as the seller, I mean, they're more likely to get that offer accepted if you're saying, you're not going to back out of the contract because something comes up. But that buyer has to cover, you know what I mean? Have that conversation with the buyer and say, if say something's wrong with, I don't know, pick something, and it's going to cost you $5,000 to fix it, and you're not doing a contingency to back out. Is this something that you'd be willing to cover to stay in the contract? If not, then you can't have that kind of contingency because you're not protecting your buyer. So, I think it depends
so
on it.
I'm gonna stop you right there a second though, because I want to be really clear about something. Our job is not to protect our buyers. And I think that we get into a real danger zone when we start making decisions about protecting our buyers. That's not the job. The job is to interpret current conditions to help the buyer make the best business decision possible, right? So I just want to be clear about that language, right? Because I think that different people hear that differently. And when we think that the job is to show up like the white knight and protect and wrap and bubble wrap that buyer, that's actually not what we're there to do. We're there to help them, show them all the options and make good decisions, or show them all the options and support the bad decisions that they make. Did everyone hear that? Because I get a whole lot of crap from a whole lot of people when I say things like that, but that is our job, to be clear. The job is to make sure that we bring all the options and all the pros and the cons, and then support the decision that the buyer makes, even if it's a bad one, not to protect them from their own decisions. So, and Janine, I was 100% right with you right until, and I just wanted to jump in to comment on that phrase, because it's a phrase that gets a lot of agents in trouble, and it's a phrase that kind of distracts us from what we're there to do. And I personally think that a lot of you struggle getting your offers accepted because of that mindset. You're doing all this pre-work with the buyer that doesn't have the offer go out in a manner that is attractive to a seller, because there's so much lawyering that's going on the back end, right? And so much protection that's going on in the back end. Because here's what's real: the seller doesn't give a crap about protecting anybody, right? And so if the seller has 12 people, all of whom are fighting over this house, and your buyers are so protected, the buyer doesn't, the seller doesn't care. And so the seller's gonna be like, okay, that person, no thanks, because they're gonna leap or run at the first sign of trouble. I did love what Janine said though up front though. What she said was, are your people prepared financially and mentally to deal with the things that come up, right? That's a really important point.
Right. Yeah.
If they're not prepared, guess what? The first sign of trouble, they're going to be running for the hills or expecting the seller to make concessions.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for helping me to revise my language. So yeah, maybe helping them prepare and giving them, a worst case scenario so they can make the decision. So I understand what you're saying. Thank you very much.
Yeah, I've spent a ton of time working on different language ideas, right? And so I know I sound heavy-handed when I jump in on things like that, but it's because I've experienced those conversations both ways, with certain language and then with different language. And the conversations you get to have with your buyers are so much more powerful, utilizing really objective, clear language that doesn't confuse the point that's being made. Go ahead, Ryan.
Just so I'm totally clear on this, when you're filling out this form, and I know we weren't going to talk about the forms here, but when talking about waiving the contingency, if you check off waive inspection contingency, and I presume you then wouldn't put a date in the inspection due by, you are not waiving your ability to do it. And would there be any concern with the listing agent coming back when you said, we'd like to do inspections on this date, them saying, what inspections you're talking about? You waived these. Have you ever run into that? Because that honestly, that was my interpretation. If you waived, you're not doing inspections, whether they be for informational purposes or otherwise.
Yeah, so I addressed that personally, and it's how I would advise you to do it as well, by doing something slightly different on the documentation. You will check waive or not check that it's contingent, depending on the form you're using. You're either checking we're waiving, or you're checking we're not making it contingent. However, I still put a date in there. I still put a date in the inspections will be done within the next 3 days. And then I write in for informational purposes only. Right. And so I kind of do the overkill thing. I'm waiving the contingency. However, I'm still doing them. And they're being done by this particular date, because the seller needs to know all that information to assess my offer efficiently and effectively. And I'm clear that it's for informational purposes only. And then when I have a conversation, once I present the offer and I have a conversation with the listing agent, I just reiterate all that all over again. So we're clear, my intent is to actually do my inspections. For me, they're always pre-scheduled, right? So it's not, we're gonna get them done in 7 days, I'll get back to you. My conversation with the listing agent is, I have an inspection scheduled for tomorrow at 12 noon. All the seller has to do is say yes to my offer, and I'll confirm that appointment. Right, so mine are always pre-scheduled, because I want the seller to understand that not only am I making a strong offer, and not only am I waiving what I'm waiving and doing what I'm doing, but that I'm also moving very swiftly, such that I've already pre-scheduled the inspection. It also shows a level of confidence. And the language that I use with the listing agent, both verbally and in emails that we'll send back and forth, always talk about, can't wait to hear back with an acceptance. Please let me know when we might hear back with your acceptance. Please let me know about the acceptance of our offer, so I can confirm tomorrow's appointment with the inspector at 12 noon. And it doesn't matter to me in those scenarios if the listing agent says, oh my goodness, you know what, I don't know if we can accommodate tomorrow. Okay, well, it's scheduled for tomorrow at 12 noon. Say yes, and then come back and say yes, however, we can't do tomorrow at 12 noon, and then we'll figure that out, right? But I always want to push all of my strengths forward, both in writing and then follow up verbally. Does that make sense, Ryan, in terms of explaining how that would work?
Yeah, very much. Thank you.
Sure. All right, guys, it's 2:01. We are fast out of time already. Any other strategies that you want to make sure that we get on the table before we finish?
I just wanted to comment earlier about what you talked about, escalation clauses. I was rushing out, so I didn't get a chance to mention it, but on the seller end in this competitive market, and the last house I sold had 20 offers in a day, and half of them had escalation clauses. And, some of them, there was one, like you said, that was only like a few $1,000s. And the one I chose was one that had a $20,000 escalation clause. And I ended up getting 50 grand over the asking price. Now, this is a different market. That's always going to happen. But as a seller, I, completely dismissed the escalation clause that wasn't even competitive. So anyway, I just wanted to make that comment that I liked what you said about that. Really good point. Thank you.
Yeah, and following on what Janine just said, let's kind of close on this, because we didn't touch on it and it's important. Guys, sometimes the way to win is just pay more. Right? Sometimes you have to be willing to show up and just pay more for a house. And what I mean by that is oftentimes the conversations that we have with our buyers are all about helping them find the best house at the lowest price and whatnot. Again, I would encourage you not to be having those conversations today in the market that the buyers are forced to perform in, right? Because what the buyers really have to understand is you are going to be one of many, many people viewing this property. You're going to likely be one of, if it's an attractive property for you, you're likely going to be one of many offers. And so I want to have a conversation up front with you around what that means and how aggressive you will likely have to be if you want to come out on top, right? You have to set those expectations up front, or else your buyers are going to keep losing over and over and over again. And here's what happens, just so you know. Over time, it becomes your incompetence, even though it has nothing to do with, even though it has little to do with you. In their head, it starts to become, you know what, I just don't think this guy is really doing his job well. I don't think she knows what she's doing because we keep losing. Because you never had the expectation conversation up front that here's what this is going to look like. And so because you didn't do that, then you're not confident enough to, when you're writing the offer, to help push them to do the things they have to do, which can include spending more money. My script for that with buyers was always this: Mr. and Mrs. Buyer, you know, the last thing that I ever want to do is come to you and say, hey, you know what? In order to live in this house, you're going to have to spend more money. However, based on the conversation we had 2 weeks ago around what market conditions currently are, that's exactly what you may need to do to be the winner here. Knowing there are multiple offers, and that in multiple offer scenarios, there is typically somebody who's at the asking price, somebody who's below it, and multiple people who are above it. I'm curious, which of those three people do you think you want to be in order to come out on top? So then they themselves get to pick, well, you know, if we're going to win, we're likely going to have to be the ones over the asking price. Yeah, I agree with that. I'm curious, have you ever purchased insurance? Well, yes. Great. And so I want to just have a quick conversation with you. When you are in a multiple offer situation and you're the one who decides to be over the asking price, determining where to go over the asking price is kind of like buying insurance. Your ability to feel comfortable and protect yourself against anything that might come your way has everything to do with the amount of insurance that you choose to buy. Writing this offer is no different. So what you need to determine is, knowing that the list price in a scenario like this is the minimum requirement that the seller has now set, how much insurance on top of that minimum requirement do you want to purchase? And I always just liked that conversation because it helped people it gave people everyone's purchased insurance, right? And so you have to buy levels of insurance. How much did you buy? Well, how comfortable did you want to feel? When you bought life insurance, did you buy 250,000, 500, a million, 5 million, 10 million? How much comfort did you want to have if something happened to you that the people around you were taken care of? This is not a different conversation. You have to buy your insurance here. And the more you buy, the more protected you are against external forces coming in and screwing up your day. Right? It is the same thing. And I always found that buyers kind of understood it and made decisions based on it. So for what that's worth, just as a money script, I wanted to at least lay that on the table. If you come back tomorrow for navigating through multiple offers, we'll kind of go through that and more tomorrow. All right, guys, it is 2:07. We are out of time. I hope this was helpful. It's a little different than what I anticipated, but again, you guys, that's what you wanted, and that's what we were able to deliver. You let me know what would be helpful, and we'll keep delivering that. So have an awesome afternoon. Have fun. We'll see you tomorrow at 1 o'clock.
Thank you.
Thanks, Rick.
Bye.
Thanks, Rick.